John, I think you're on mute.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks again for reconvening today. Apologies for the delay. I'm having some slight technical difficulties, but I think we are all set to go at this point. I think we can get started with everything. You should be able to see my screen, correct?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'm just going to go over a few introductory things first, but I want to get right into the discussion since this is essentially a continuation of our previous meeting. So just as a reminder, the workgroup members who are here today should have the opportunity to participate throughout the meeting. So you are already set up as panelists and you should be able to unmute yourselves, or you can enter any questions or comments in the chat dialogue as well. And we will take questions throughout the meeting for general attendees. You can enter questions into the questions box. We will try to get to those, but since the focus is on the discussion of the workgroup members today, there's no guarantee that we'll get to any of the questions that you might be entering in the questions box. But if we don't get to them today, we can try to follow up as well after the meeting. And lastly, there will be a recording of the presentation posted online as well as the slide deck on the Biochar protocol webpage. So just to, I just want to do a quick tech check with everyone. So we're going to go through really quick introductions just to make sure everyone's audio is working and their mic, they're able to turn on their mics. So just kind of going through the list here again. I'm John, you all know me. We've convened before. Heather is not going to be attending. She's now on maternity leave for the next several months. So she was able to help get things started. And we're grateful for her support, but she won't be attending the next couple of workgroup meetings. Holly, do you want to say a quick hello? Make sure everything's working all right?
Yeah, thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited about continuing this discussion today.
Thanks, Holly. And Marissa?
Morning, everyone.
Great, sounds like it's working. And John, it looked like you were logged in.
Good morning, all. John Nickerson here.
Great, thanks. All right, and then let's go through the list here. Akio, are you logged in?
Hey, no webcam today. Sketch chat. All right.
Okay, we're able to hear you. It's a little spotty, it sounds like, but hopefully that won't be an issue when you have anything to say later. Thanks. Allison?
Yeah, I'm here. Again, no video, but I'm here listening and ready to participate.
Great, thanks. Bruce?
Hello, morning. I'm here.
Great, glad your audio is working this time. Doesn't look like Dan is logged in. So we can move on to David.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Great, thanks. And Hannes?
Yes, hi everyone. Happy to be there. I might switch off my video camera in between to make coffee because it's late in the evening, but I'm here.
Thanks, Hannes. Jeff, are you able to say hello? Looks like you're logged in, but I'm not sure if your audio is connected.
He was having issues with his sound earlier, John, so hopefully if he's able to log back in, it's resolved, but I'll follow up with him.
Okay, great, thanks, Holly. Doesn't look like Johannes is logged in either. And Jonah is not going to be able to make it today. And John is not attending, but I believe his colleague Saeed is logged on. Yep, I see Saeed
Yeah.
now.
Hi, John. So John will not be attending, so I'll be attending on his behalf.
Glad you're able to join us today. Okay. Next we have Josiah. Looks like your video is working.
Yep, here.
Great, and we can hear you. And I can see Kevin.
Hi, everybody.
Great, audio is working. Matt, you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody. Nice to be on the call today.
Great, glad you're able to join us today, Matt. Melissa, looks like you're logged in.
Yep, I'm here. Just no video today. It's a pajama day, so I'd spare you.
Great. And Nate, it looks like you're logged in as well.
Yep. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Great, thanks. And Patricio.
Hey, guys. Great to see everybody again.
And Phil, is your audio working?
Yes. Hello. Good morning, everyone.
Great. And Rachel, is your audio working too?
Yep, seems to be working. Hi, everyone.
Great, thanks. And Sean was not going to be able to join us today, and it doesn't look like Tristan is logged in at this point either. So, okay, I think we can proceed. Okay, so just really quickly, I want to acknowledge once again our funding support for this work from the Forest Service as well as from CAL FIRE. We are ever grateful for their support in this endeavor. And I just wanted to really quickly recap a few things that at least I took away from the last meeting and some of the comments in follow-up to that meeting. And that was, there seemed to be a desire to include project aggregation. It seemed like there was a lot of consensus around that. And part of that being a pathway for smaller producers to be able to participate under this protocol. There's a desire to have mixed feedstocks as something eligible under the protocol as well as feedstocks from public lands. And then lastly, having non-commercial end uses eligible as well for use under this protocol. And then there's also discussion around verification and credit issuance frequency and a desire to have it basically as frequent as possible, or at least have the option for that. And then lastly, just a note around how verification of the end use of biochar is something that's really challenging, but it's really important for the integrity of the protocol. And so that's something we're definitely going to be paying attention to as we go through drafting and get further feedback from you. The focus that I wanted to have for today, there's still a number of topics to cover, but in particular, these are the ones that I wanted to make sure that we're able to discuss, and they are baseline scenarios, the potential to include non-sequestration based GHG benefits, and then determining and quantifying the carbon permanence and recalcitrance in the biochar, and then whether or not we can leverage other certification programs that are out there to make things more efficient for projects. So as we were going through last time, you may have noticed that if you're familiar with how our protocols work, we have kind of a standard layout for our protocols and sections that we go through. And so that's kind of what we were doing last time as well. And so I just want to pick up where we left off last time before we get to some of the bigger topics, I guess. And this is where we left off last time, was the project location. And so the intent going into this was to definitely include the United States and Canada as eligible geographies for projects. But one thing that we've been kind of tossing around is whether or not we might be able to include Mexico. It seems like perhaps not at this point, but if there are any particular thoughts that any of you have around being able to include Mexico, I'd be definitely interested in hearing it. And there's also this issue of the potential for feedstocks and end uses to be located outside of the United States. I think feedstocks might be more problematic just because we need to be able to ensure the sustainability of the feedstocks, whereas end uses, it might be a little bit easier to document what the end use is. So if there are any particular thoughts around
Hey, John, just out of curiosity, why is Mexico not being included? Just out of curiosity.
Just because there are potentially different issues around additionality and the baselines that might be different enough in Mexico that it would take quite a bit more work to figure those out and come up with something that we could really use in the protocol.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So I think the default at this point would be to not include Mexico, but if it appears that there is enough reason and data and documentation to be able to include it, then we might be able to consider that.
On our side, we are very close to several, oh, this is Melissa speaking, by the way, if you can't see me. You know, we're very close to several producers around the world in North America, and there is very little project that we hear about coming from Mexico. So I think it would be, for now, perhaps a good way to save a lot of labor, if I could say that, to not include Mexico. That being said, I'm sure that if we include Mexico, it is doable and there will be projects developing there. I just don't see right now a lot of projects coming out of there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good feedback. Okay. Yeah, and I guess one reason why I was asking about end uses in particular potentially being located out of the US or Canada is just, you know, I've heard of some producers shipping materials overseas. And so whether or not that's something we would want to consider in this protocol was just something I wasn't certain about, just because there's an additional burden that might go along with that in terms of verification, especially if we end up having the verifiers looking at the end uses at all. So that's something we can continue to mull over and figure out if there are any restrictions that we need to include on that. But if any of you have any thoughts on that, feel free to reach out with any comments later, if you don't have anything now.
Maybe, John, one point in terms of feedstock transportation. Depending a bit on the safeguards that we put on the sourcing of the feedstocks, it might be considered an excessive export of biomass to other countries, which might not be very favorable. But this depends basically on how much offtake you allow in terms of sourcing biomass from areas. You don't want clear cutting in the US and then have it exported to other areas, which basically would then shortcut other export regulations.
Yeah. Thanks, Hans. Okay, no other thoughts around that. We can keep moving. So in terms of additionality, you know, this is the basic notion that we are making sure that we're only crediting for actions that are taking place above and beyond that what would have occurred if the project hadn't taken place. And the two basic tests that we include in our protocols are the legal requirements test, which is basically making sure that the project activities aren't the kind of thing that are legally required, and that's considering all laws and regulations that are relevant to the project, whether that's local, state, or federal. And then we also use a performance standard, and it's, you know, basically a standardized test that can be applied in a number of different ways. I think what we would look at for this protocol, though, is just looking at kind of what I would call a categorical acceptance of biochar, because the production and use of biochar remains uncommon at this point relative to the typical fate of the biomass sources that we're talking about. And because biochar provides some sort of financial incentive for, or sorry, the offset credits provide some sort of financial incentive for the production of biochar. So I think we should be able to apply a relatively simple performance standard test in this case, and then of course all other eligibility requirements have to be met, just kind of as a safeguard in terms of that performance standard. Now, as this all relates to baseline scenarios, that's something that we definitely want to discuss, and we'll be touching on that several slides from now, so we can hold off on that discussion for the time being.
I have a question that I raised in my email. How does, CAR and people obviously that are involved in the work group see the 808, the USDA 808 coming up and affecting this?
Yeah, that's a good question, Melissa. I'm not sure how much it would necessarily affect this, since that is it's a voluntary standard. I guess I'm not sure. Do you have anything in mind in terms of how you feel like it might affect things with this protocol?
Well, I know that the additionality here would be based on, legal requirement and performance standard, but there are, of course, some financial implications. And so if farmers are actually paid to use biochar, I'm just not sure how it would impact additionality, even though a financial additionality might fall a little bit out of the scope in this particular methodology. But if the entire cost of biochar is covered by the government through subsidy, I don't know. Yeah, I don't have an actual question. I'm just wondering how it's going to impact additionality and also the market, the demand for it.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know that there's necessarily a straightforward answer at this point. There are a lot of factors, I think, going into the use of biochar and the production of it, and whether or not that kind of standard will affect things. At this point, I think maybe until we're able to see some impact from it, it's hard for us to be able to factor that in necessarily.
I can speak to it perhaps a little bit. This is Josiah. The EQIP funding potential, I think, if we're to put this in buckets, and to look at the biochar production potential in the U.S. versus the EQIP funding potential, there is a great size disparity, in that there is just not sufficient funding in EQIP to make a huge dent in the biochar production potential in the US. And so I think that's one factor. And I think the funding per acre is another. And currently it's in the hundreds, 200, 400 per acre kind of range. From what I've seen so far, that would not really seem to have a dramatic impact on the additionality or baseline factors. And I think that what we're looking at is that in most cases the carbon credit can help offset cost of production, but there's still processing, transportation, and operating expenses to move biochar from place to place. And that best case scenario, the EQIP funding can be instrumental in helping offset the actual transportation and plowing in of the biochar on farm. So I do recognize that there's something there. I don't see a pathway for it to be a dramatic or even significant impact on the additionality or baseline question. And I think, John, your point as well is that it should be considered and watched as it evolves in case that may change.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to echo that. I'm curious. I don't think anyone's disagreeing with the bullet there that biochar production remains uncommon, but just how would you evaluate that over time, and sort of what adoption rates would you need to see, and like how would you classify that? Because I could imagine some end uses eventually could have other economically viable options that could provide funding outside of carbon offsets. So I think just kind of putting some bounds around like how you would evaluate that in the future could be useful as you're developing the protocol now.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think that's a good point too. And you know, there are different ways of evaluating it, or different thresholds that we could look at. You know, we've used different thresholds for different protocols too. So figuring out what might be an appropriate, either an appropriate threshold or an appropriate way or an approach to evaluating how uncommon biochar production is something that we do need to consider and consider carefully. And I don't know, Hannes, if you're willing to comment on how you set up the standard under the VCS methodology that you have proposed, because I believe you're using at least initially a 5% threshold. Just curious how you arrived at that number.
Basically, we.
Oops, we lost your audio, Hannes.
That works now? No?
Yep.
All right. So basically, we looked at other Vera standards and methodologies, which are basically looking at a 5% performance threshold. I think the key question is basically where do you get the data from, as was pointed out before, and this is where we've pointed out the best case of the worst data sets. So we've looked at what kind of data sets are available in the biochar space, which is basically just one from FAO, which we've referenced. So, and I think this would be the major challenge, especially if CAR takes a more regional approach for the Northern Americas. I don't know how the data quality is in terms of who's tracking biochar production, if there's a regional board entity that could track this. But I would recommend to look more specifically into regional values for biochar production and or application.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah, that makes sense too.
And there's a time factor as well, because as credits are becoming available now, is biochar production common because of the credits now available supporting its use? And I think that will be increasingly difficult to answer 5 years from now, when biochar production might be much more common because of the carbon credit. So that it creates an interesting paradox in how you measure the commonality, I guess, you know, how common it is.
Yep, thanks for that. Yeah, so I think this is something we'll have to consider carefully and probably figure out some guidance that we're able to insert into the protocol, maybe around how and when we might be able to reevaluate the additionality of projects under the performance standard. But I think there are a number of examples that we can look to, at least for the time being. But it is hard because if you do put a specific number on things, you're kind of, and you say if biochar production exceeds a certain amount, then you're kind of putting a cap on the amount of credits that can be issued, and there's some strange incentives and potentially perverse outcomes that could result from that. So we need to be careful around that as well. Okay. Any other thoughts on the performance standard before we move on? And again, feel free to send any comments or questions after this as well. As a standard part of our protocols, we also require that projects are in compliance with all relevant laws and regulations. So again, the focus is on anything that is related to biochar production. At the moment, the thought is that the feedstocks and end uses, at least in terms of regulatory compliance, will be addressed mainly through the eligibility requirements that we build into the protocol. And so the focus for compliance generally for the project will be really focused on the actual production of biochar in that process. Okay, so for permanence, we have this idea that any carbon that is sequestered has to remain permanent for 100 years. For what we're talking about with biochar, we are crediting for sequestered carbon, and we need to figure out essentially how much carbon we can expect to be remaining in place in that biochar carbon 100 years after it's been sequestered or made into biochar. And how best to actually do that, we're going to address later in the quantification section, so I'm kind of teeing that up. But one thing that I wanted to talk about in particular here is just the risk of reversals that we have. So the idea that the carbon that is sequestered in biochar could potentially be reverted back into the atmosphere, and figuring out how, if there are reversals, those that lost carbon is replaced or we're accounting for it somehow. So trying to figure out if there are significant risks of reversals, and then how to address that, if it's buffer pool contributions like we use in other protocols, or if there's potentially just a discount that we could apply from the outset, rather than relying on a buffer pool if we aren't able to actually monitor reversals in the end, which seems like it could be an issue with this, being able to actually track the long-term fate of biochar in the environment.
John, considering the 100-year frame, something that we haven't looked for the Vera methodology would be the ton-year approach. So basically, if you have a storage which is below 100 years, you just deduct a certain threshold, a certain number of credits. The IPCC has drafted this for the Apollo sector. So for agricultural removals, I posted the link in the chat here. So maybe this would be something to consider, and this would maybe unlock also other use cases. I don't know if we have building elements which are just assumed to be permanent for 25 years. This would correspond, according to the IPCC approach, to just issuing 15% of the credits. But then, and you would deduct this this permanence continuing contingency then.
Yeah, so it would be instead of monitoring for reversals and addressing it through that and compensating via buffer pools, it would be incorporating ton-year accounting to provide what's essentially kind of an immediate discount based on what assurances we do have as to the permanence for the carbon that's sequestered. And that is something, that is an approach that we use with some of our other protocols, and both in our traditional offset program and our climate forward program. So I think that, that's generally something that we're fairly comfortable with. So that could be something we bring in here. So thanks for the suggestion. I guess maybe the broader question is just if there are significant risks of reversals for biochar. Considering the various end uses that we have, if we're looking at soils as the major likely end use, are there risks of reversals that we really need to consider and factor into our accounting for this? It seems like the risks are relatively low. So whether or not we need.
Sorry, John. In our mind, the most significant risk for reversals is fire. The IPCC has noted that. I mean, most biochar producers know it's not a matter of, if the biochar is going to catch on fire. It's a matter of when their biochar is going to catch on fire. However, in terms of the reversal specifically regarding, a credit, if a credit is not issued until there is a final resting place in the soil, then there is really little risk of reversals at all. If the credit is issued out of the gate of a factory, then you increase your risk of reversals, because if a truckload catches on fire, then you've already issued credits for it potentially, and now you have reversal. So it's kind of going back to the system boundary question that we can assess reversals. But in my opinion, aside from actual fires, there's very little, unintended reversals.
Okay, thanks, Melissa.
And also, John, I just wanted to mention that Akio posted a paper, a publication in the chat box regarding permanence.
Okay.
Meta-analysis.
Great, thanks.
And I'm guessing the permanence question also crosses over with end uses that are accepted or potential other categories. So for instance, if we're looking at the permanence in soil, that's going to be kind of a known quantity and very well studied, whereas there are other end uses that might have a different permanent pathway, a different permanence pathway. Is that part of the question here?
Yeah, I think it's maybe slightly different than what we're talking about with reversals, but I think it's related. So like in my mind, I guess maybe what I think of when you say that, Josiah, is if we have biochar that's being used in some sort of construction materials, we need to consider the longevity of those materials or the structures that they're being put into, what the typical lifetime is of the resulting products that it's being used in, and try to figure out how to address the permanence of the carbon in that based on that longevity.
And that's the ton-year approach that you're that's being discussed.
Yeah, that's one way of addressing it, potentially.
I understand that we want to consider permanence for at least 100 years, and if less, then probably go in ton years. Will there be an actual consideration for estimating a permanence that is larger than 100 years? Because when we actually think about it, well, first of all, in soils, the permanence of biochar is not, there's no recognized, internationally recognized scientific model to accurately determine the permanence of carbon in biochar in soils. But most estimates range from, 50 years up to 600, 700, 800 years. Will the methodology actually account for those longer years, or is it more going to be in the weight of the producer to market their biochar for, a higher price, whatever it is, based on those expected length of permanence?
In terms of what is used in the protocol itself, it would be a 100-year standard. So there wouldn't be any additional crediting per se around biochar that would have greater durability beyond 100 years. 100 years is kind of the standard that we use, in part because the equivalence factors between methane and nitrous oxide are based on 100 years, and that's kind of our programmatic standard, is a 100-year permanent standard. So it's all kind of fixed to that 100-year basis.
And John, sorry, Josiah here. That's for the percentage of carbon remaining at the 100-year mark. Is that correct? Is that the Climate Action Reserve viewpoint, that we measure how much carbon is there, and then we, using the HC.org and other methodologies such as IKEO has put there, you're going to be estimating the amount of carbon remaining after 100 years. So if the biochar was so unstable as to have only a potentially 50-year life cycle in the soil, your 100-year carbon count would be 0, because none would be left after 100 years. Whereas if your biochar had a mean residence time of 1,000 years, with perhaps 80% of it, 90% of it still remaining after 100 years, that 80–90% is what you're accounting for, with some sort of buffer for calculation error. Does that sound about right?
Yep. Yeah.
Can I make a quick comment here? We're speaking as though, and I know it's a simplification, but we're speaking as though there's some, cliff that the biochar is falling off of, that you've got 100% of the biochar, and that at some point in the future, all of it is released to the atmosphere. And we all know, and Josiah just sort of used the term mean residence time, we all know that it's actually more complicated than that. And there's while much slower than non-pyrolized organic material, there's going to be some sort of rate of emission or decay of that char, and that even in the case where there's a 50-year mean residence time, there probably would be some still present after 100 years. There are mathematical approaches that are emerging in the life cycle accounting literature for accounting for an emission trajectory over time in terms of 100-year global warming potential. So it's still on a 100-year GWP basis, but we're not just saying if 10% of the carbon is left after 100 years, therefore you only get 10% of the credit, because what if the majority of the carbon is sequestered for 90 of that 100 years? Do you not get any credit for the temporary sequestration, which, while not out to 100 years, is still significant and is still yielding some climate benefit? And there are approaches that, as I said, are emerging for accounting for essentially what is the amount of carbon released in year one or avoided in year one, CO2, that is equivalent in terms of the aggregate forcing effect over a 100-year period to this emission trajectory or this sequestration trajectory. If we have a bunch of carbon that's present in the soil for 80 years, and then some of it starts to emit, and then out to 100 years and potentially beyond, what is the sort of CO2 equivalent and sort of like a net present value type accounting of that temporary sequestration? And that would be an approach, and it's not, it's mathematically complex to derive, but it's not mathematically complex to apply. If we could get to a place where we say, here is the assumed decay rate of biochar in soil X, Y, or Z, we could get to what is the CO2 equivalent on a 100-year global warming potential basis for the presence of the carbon in that soil.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
I think that's interesting, looking at that, what you're talking about with a curve type model. Generally, the way it's been looked at is oftentimes referenced as pools, just kind of pools of carbon, or tiers, and that generally it's on the front end in the first 5 to 10 years that you would see the fastest rate of decay. Any kind of loose or label carbon is gonna bounce in that first 5 to 10 years, and that the material remaining after that is the more stable, and that the further you go along that timeline, the slower the decay rate would be. That's kind of what most of the research and models have been able to show. And I think that, again, it's amazing how far the science has come in the past several years in regarding not just the permanence of biochar, but the accuracy at which the permanence can be determined. And I think, just a brief, review of the article that Akio Enders has put in there can help show that there's quite a lot of robust research in the area of being able to determine permanence for these 100-year cycles, so that we can kind of accurately determine that, yes, for a given material, we're looking at 90% of that carbon still remaining after 100 years. And that for a given biochar material, not for all biochar materials, but for a given material based on its characteristics as measured, we can have fairly accurate prediction of the life cycle.
And so that would be the approach that we would take, is just to say the amount of carbon still present in the soil at year 100 is the amount of carbon that you're credited for, regardless of the sort of emission profile that gets you there.
Well, there's the greenhouse gas emission reduction question that gets really interesting. And I think that the general consensus is that if we start to look at the avoided emissions and the delta between, you know, the methane emissions if the slash pile was burned in the forest versus the methane emissions if it was transformed into biochar in a very contained and well monitored system, that brings in complexities of accounting that might be better dealt with in a separate and compatible methodology. Whereas looking at just the embodied carbon in the biochar, the stability of that carbon over a 100-year cycle is pretty solid. That's been researched a lot, and it's going to be a lot easier to build a stable accounting methodology that can be repeatedly utilized and is highly credible and recognized. I think that's kind of the direction. John, correct me if I'm wrong here, though.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the basic approach that we had envisioned, but at the same time, Kevin, I would like to learn a little bit more about what you're referring to and get a better understanding of it, just to see if that is something that we might consider, because it does seem like it could be a nuanced approach that we could potentially build in.
John, this is John Nickerson. It seems like what we could do is apply the 10-year accounting rules for the quantification of carbon, whether it persists 100 years or 50 years, and look at the time value of the carbon out of the atmosphere through the same 10-year accounting rules. And that would address what Kevin's talking about, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it doesn't have to last 100 years, but we look at the time value of the carbon that is held out of the atmosphere. And we could use that same approach to the decay of material in the woods.
Yep. Yeah, good point, John. Thanks.
Following all these comments, I do have a quick question. Now, there's a lot of buzz in the market around removals versus, reductions and avoidances. What do you intend on actually naming this type of offset? Are you going to go in the removal game? Are you going to go in an avoidance or sequestration? How do we intend on calling this product, naming it?
Yeah, I don't know that we have any differentiation within our program in terms of the types of climate benefits that are produced. There has been some discussion internally about whether that's something that we might want to consider just within our registry in terms of differentiating between certain climate reserve tons, which is the name of our credits, and being able to allocate them to either removals or avoided emissions or emissions reductions. But at the moment, we don't have any definite plans for that type of change. So at the moment, they're all kind of lumped together just as climate reserve tons, and we don't label anything in a particular way.
Sounds good. Thanks, John.
Mm-hmm.
John, I just did want to mention that Rachel made a comment or posed a question to biochar producers. She asked, how common is spontaneous combustion? Does this need to be accounted for in reversals?
Any producers on the line who can address that?
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet. We've produced a lot of biochar, and typically for biochar that's utilized in in soil and agricultural settings, there is no negative implications of adding water, as long as you keep your water content low enough to make shipping easy. Adding water is plus. It's a benefit all across the board. And so it is standard practice to moisten the material at the tail end of production. Some people are quenching with water. Others will simply just add water as soon as possible. Bringing the moisture content up to 40% makes for ease of shipping and handling. It lowers the dust, and the material is so light and fluffy generally that you don't take a big hit on shipping. So it's general standard practice that most companies are adding water, though I think that it should be considered that there may be applications, such as when biochar is blended into fertilizer products, that there is a advantage to keeping it dry and shipping it dry, so that it can be blended with other things, and particularly if it's going to be added into building materials. So I do foresee that even though the risk of fire has traditionally been low, that it will be a risk at some level. And I think that points towards the importance of end use confirmation as opposed to production confirmation.
Yeah, I have to agree with Joshua, although I will disagree in a way that actual, self-ignition, spontaneous combustion of biochar is very much a risk that is incurred by every single biochar producer. Those who separate biochar from a larger product in general may be less at risk. But if you're making a biochar with a high carbon content, you generally also have a high energy content and self-ignition risk for sure. And so Joshua is right when he says that we should put the system boundary and issue credits only when it either gets to the final user or it is in this resting place, because otherwise the risk of reversals, as we mentioned earlier, are very much present for fires.
Yeah,
and Akio adds to this and says, chemistry says that if spontaneous combustion is going to occur, it will soon after the char has been produced, when it's still hot.
Yeah, I will add that actually some biochars have self-ignition properties. So even if it is produced and cooled at a certain temperature, some of them it happens in some instances that they warm up after production to a higher temperature than what they are, basically put in big bags for. So that's definitely a danger that every seasoned biochar producer kind of knows about. But he's right. So misting, quenching is generally best practices if there is no requirement for biochar to be dry in its end use application.
Yeah, I think this does all highlight the importance of the verification of the confirmation of the end use of the biochar, including the amount that actually gets to where it's supposed to be going. So this is helpful. Okay, I would like to move on to make sure we're able to get to some of the additional topics here. So I just want to touch on the greenhouse gas assessment boundary. So this is basically delineating what we're accounting for in terms of the sources, sinks, and reservoirs for each project. The basic idea is that we are looking to eliminate areas where there isn't really any significant difference between a baseline and a project scenario. So we don't have to account for those emissions or those pools. But where there is a significant difference between the baseline and the project, then we do want to make sure we're encapsulating that in our accounting. And then similarly, if there are emissions that are relatively insignificant relative to the overall project emission profile, that's something else that we might be able to consider not including anyways, just because it's simply de minimis. So I have a few slides here that are just identifying at least some initial sources, sinks, and reservoirs that we might be considering. I actually kind of want to skip through this at the moment because a lot of this is going to, what we include here in the end is going to be dependent on largely on the baselines that we're able to consider, as well as the types of projects that we consider to be eligible under the protocol. So this might be something to circle back to, or we might just give you an opportunity to comment on these after the fact, after the meeting, and after we're able to have the baseline discussion. So that is what I would like to turn to now, is just figuring out how to go about setting baselines under this protocol. You know, there are different approaches that have been proposed or used under different methodologies. You know, the simplest approach is obviously just assuming that there are 0 emissions associated with the baseline. But there's also been, you know, more regionally specific baselines that could potentially be used, including bioenergy production or combustion on site or decomposition. And so what I'm hoping, I guess, to get from the work group is just general thoughts on our ability to set baselines that are maybe more specific, being more regionally specific, or if we should rely more on the 0 emissions scenario as the baseline, since that is a conservative scenario.
Yeah, I'll just comment here that I feel strongly that we do want to have variable counterfactual outcomes because the emissions associated with these different fates for a given pool of residue are vastly different from one another. And therefore, if we make a uniform assumption across the board, then that will either be best case scenario that's overly conservative and we're leaving money on the table that could otherwise go to promoting the more climate beneficial biochar pathways, or worst scenario is we're not sufficiently conservative and we're crediting tons that aren't actually being avoided. And so, you know, at least accounting for some, you know, a differential between on-site combustion and decomposition, that is residues that would otherwise have been burned in the field versus residues that would not otherwise have been burned in the field. It seems to me that we need to account for that differential. We can't just assume that all of the char or all of the residue would have been burned in the field. This does, you know, create a reporting challenge, because what is the proof of a counterfactual outcome for a given pool of residue? And then, you know, within that, there of course is geographic variability that we can't capture all of, but I think we should at least make an attempt to capture some of. I don't think that it's reasonable to assume that these residues would otherwise have gone to bioenergy or bioelectricity production, unless you have, you know, otherwise, and then, you know, if you do, then you have leakage concerns around you're diverting a pool of residue that would otherwise have gone to biopower. So then that biopower facility, unless it shuts down, is now using other residues. I also don't think it's reasonable to assume that there's 0 emissions. If we're using a residue base, then there's emissions associated with it. It's counterfactual.
Maybe one thing to add from my side on the voting strongly for a conservative 0 emissions baseline, which is a bit the alternative scenarios, which would be either avoided combustion or avoided decomposition. I'm not really sure how to differentiate between the carbon. So figuring out we have a molecule of carbon which might be emitted if it's combusted. So this would count as an avoided emission because you don't combust it, right? But now you put it through the pyrolysis process, and now the same molecule of carbon is counted twice for avoidance because it's not combusted. So that's 1 ton or one credit, and then it is stored as biochar. That's another credit. So now you've counted the same carbon amount twice, which would, I think, count as double counting, to my understanding. So to me, the question is a bit, how do you differentiate?
I'd like to add to this in saying that actually a lot of biochar producers are selling their energy either to their neighbors or using it in other processes. So it is also a bioenergy production site, perhaps not a giant, a biomass power plant, but a lot of smaller units do intend either on injecting in the grid or sell their energy. So it adds to the complexity here.
Kevin, do you think there is the data available to be able to set up regional specific baselines?
I know there's some work that's coming out shortly in environmental science and technology out of Argonne National Lab, and their team did an analysis that at least is like 20 Western states. But I'm not sure, honestly. There's the biosum model. We could look into it. It does get complicated, and if you don't have the sort of, I don't have emission factors I can hand you. Sure. So short of that, it does become a research question that I don't know if you're set up to do that analysis. So yeah, I mean, I'm maybe pointing to a problem without a ready solution, and I recognize that, and that poses a challenge. I'm trying to wrap my head around the point that Hannes was just making about the zero emission baseline and what the implications of that would be, and the concerns for double counting. It's not readily apparent to me where we're getting those concerns for double counting, but I maybe have to think about it further, or maybe it warrants a follow-up conversation between us, Hannes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, could we clarify maybe what we mean by assume zero emissions? Because it seems like in the baseline, you have to assume that the feedstock would have decomposed or be combusted. And I'm also just wondering how that plays out for agricultural residues versus woody feedstocks, where woody feedstocks might stick around for a bit longer in the forest. And you might actually have a short period where, due to pyrolysis processes, you actually lose more emissions, and there's a payback period that you have to wait. So I'm just kind of curious what the thinking is of how those types of issues will be addressed.
Yeah, thanks. At least my understanding of the assume zero emissions is just that it is a conservative approach that's kind of used as a default. That doesn't, it kind of gets around the issue of trying to figure out what a reasonable counterfactual scenario is for a project, and by setting it as a zero, setting the baseline as a zero emissions scenario, it is conservative, and by being conservative, you're able to just incorporate that because you're maintaining that conservativeness in credit issuance. And I don't know if Hannes, you have any other comments around how you determined to use a zero emissions baseline for as the default for the VCS methodology. But in general, I think it makes sense. But if we can make that sort of differentiation and come up with reasonable baseline scenarios that people can that people are able to choose from, I would like to incorporate that.
I just wanted to make Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's all right. I was just trying to rephrase what we did, which is basically go for a zero emission point because due to conservative assumption and also reporting complexities. So I think there were two arguments voting for a very conservative zero emission baseline, which is A, complexity, because you would have for each feedstock type, you would have to provide proof of the fate of the feedstock, which in itself is going to be complex. And then you have to differentiate the decomposition pathway, which then comes with another set of complexities in terms of how would that feedstock decompose, how much methane would it emit or not. And the second point is a bit, then again, a bit more from the carbon perspective is there double counting? So do you account the same emission twice or not? And I think this might be a bit more complex to explain. Happy to do and try to do that in writing or maybe as a follow-up. But basically what we determined is that in order to implement the whole methodology, most people would rather go for a rather conservative approach than going through all the hassle of explaining and producing different baseline scenarios, which vary again from project sourcing side to sourcing side. So at the end of the day, we thought about having those two options to say conservative zero. If you enjoy going through all the complexities, go ahead, that's fine, but you have to provide a thorough documentation, which is not going to be fun.
Just a couple examples of the not fun part. From a forestry perspective, I think the fate of these residues is pretty complex, and at one level, it's related to common silvicultural practices, which vary by region. So we may look at burning residues to open up growing space or to reduce the difficulties in replanting a site or something like that. But there are also policy and legal implications in some places that might be local, state, or federal in terms of how we require the treatment of residues that are left after fuel treatment or timber harvest. And so there's that dimension to it. That's probably the easiest to quantify. If there are policy or legal requirements to burn feedstock, then it's pretty cut and dry. But if there are not, and it's left up to the forester, there may be these alternative pathways. There's also a market influence here. Whether or not they're burned or not may have to do with whether or not they can be used for bioenergy production for utility scale power, for example. So there's that aspect of it. And this is not even considering mill feedstocks, where we look at the alternative fate of mill feedstocks. If they're very low quality, they're likely to be burned. But if they're higher quality, they may have an alternative market. And biochar may be a better market for those residues. So this is one of the things we were talking about on the call, is whatever the current market is for those residues. It may not be burning them in the boiler, but biochar production may be a better option. So I think this is related to simplifying the baseline in a way that doesn't require assuming something like all residues are burned all the time. That would be obviously a false assumption.
I'm just sort of puzzling through this in real time here, and I'm realizing where my sort of concern, methodological or analytical concern around this zero emission baseline comes from. If we assume, I take a ton of residue, we assume there is no emission associated with that ton in the counterfactual. If it's not residue, and we're talking purpose grown and harvested woody biomass, then I think the zero emission is honest. In fact, I would say a negative emission baseline would be appropriate because you're avoiding the potential for ongoing sequestration by harvesting intentionally to make biochar. But if we're talking a residue from some forestry activity or mill activity, et cetera, if we assume zero carbon emission as the baseline, you would need to hit 50% yield rate on your biochar reaction. That is 50% of the carbon present in the biochar instead of released through the process of pyrolysis in order to start sequestering any carbon. Because if we assume there is no emission in the counterfactual, I've got a ton of biomass, say that's half a ton of carbon, I would have to yield a quarter ton of biochar from my pyrolysis reaction, because the other quarter ton is going as CO2 to the atmosphere. So I would need to yield a quarter ton of carbon sequestered as biochar in order to sequester the first gram of carbon, if we're assuming there is no emission in the counterfactual outcome. Because, so I would need a biochar reactor that is going to be north of 50% productive, i.e. carbon present in the biochar, carbon that is in the feedstock still present in the biochar, before I even start to sequester any carbon, because the other half of the carbon is going to the atmosphere. And so I would need to, if there is no carbon emission in my counterfactual, then any emission from my pyrolyzer is net emission to the atmosphere. So I would need to offset it with sequestration and biochar, and I wouldn't start to get any sequestration until I was north of 50% productivity in my pyrolyzer, and that seems unrealistic. Does that make sense?
I'm going to jump in here. I feel like there's like 3 different conversations. Maybe I'm not sure. I feel like there's a few different things going on here, and so I'm just going to throw my perspective in to maybe confuse it more, or possibly make it less confusing. I don't know. We'll find out. So that we're looking at there's baseline. I think in the baseline that we're looking at for feedstock, we're not looking at the feedstock as the basis of the entire accounting. The feedstock is a portion of the accounting, right? So the biochar production and material, that's kind of some of the core of it, right? We have this feedstock that's going to come in from the side there, right? And that feedstock is going to enter our facility at what? That feedstock comes at a negative, at a positive. What does it come to us as? And so if we say, oh, well, that feedstock was a slash pile and it was going to burn the forest, so it's going to come to us adding to our total carbon accounting. Mm-hmm. Or that feedstock was baseline 0 in the forest, and then we had to process it and transport it. So it was 0, and then we processed it and transported it, and now it's going to take a little bit of a hit. We accounted for, you know, the processing and the transport, and then boom, it's at site, and then we make it into biochar, send it out. So I think, you know, critically is just talk about the baseline of the feedstock coming into the accounting process. And so generally how I perceived it, that looking at the other methodologies in action right now, such as the one that we're using, it's the feedstock starts at 0, and then everything you do to that feedstock can take away from your total accounting, can shrink it, but not add to it. Because if we try to account for the avoided emissions of that fuel, because it would have burned in a slash pile or something else, it just starts getting really, really, really complicated, and can make things impossibly difficult. And so the baseline of 0 being that we're not going to account for all the positives that could have happened, you know, the alternative fates of that fuel. We're going to start with it at 0. It's not going to add, but it can take away from all the processing and transportation involved with getting that feedstock into biochar production can be taken away from. And so the feedstock itself starts at 0. Everything we do to it takes away from, and then we make biochar. Does that?
I follow what you're saying. So the feedstock starts at a 0 carbon, and then you're going to credit for any carbon present on the tail end of your biochar reactor so that you end up with some carbon sequestration. But that then implies that you're not getting a deficit for any CO2 emission from your biochar reactor. Because if your feedstock starts at 0, then you would need to permanently sequester more than half of the carbon present in that feedstock in order to yield any sequestration whatsoever, because there is also carbon coming out of the tail of your reaction.
That's a different part of the equation. So that's a different part of the equation. So then you have the efficiency of production. Then you have your production sausage maker, right? So in your production, is your production efficient? You know, and how do you account for all the carbon going in there? Because biochar is an energy positive process, right? And so we're not going to have all biochar facilities tuned to maximum biochar production always and forever. At some point, some of that carbon can be devoted to energy production while also efficiently making biochar all within the same system. So the carbon that comes in, some of it's going to get balanced out by the energy production happening. And we have to look, and then you look at your emissions, your stack emissions. Are we emitting a bunch of methane and nitrous oxide in the emissions? That's going to take away from. It's going to be a huge hit, right? So you look at the process. The feedstock comes to the production process at zero minus transportation, I guess, would be one way to think of it. And then once it gets in there, you have the calculating of the process. Is your process efficient? Is your process efficient? And that's basically on your energy consumption to drive the motors and the augers, your energy production, and your stack emissions. Those would be kind of the core things there. So are you using natural gas to try and produce your biochar, or are you using, you know what I mean? So that comes into that. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I follow. I mean, and this is we're in the life cycle accounting world, and I definitely follow. But what's the productivity? The sort of what fraction of the carbon present in those chips is present in the biochar? Do you know that off the top?
It's different for different technologies.
Okay, but let's talk ballpark.
Oh, it can be quite a range, and I think that trying to pin it on that is trying to pin the conservation of carbon, I guess you could say.
Sure.
I'm not sure if that's the most useful, if that's the primary way to look at it.
At the end of the day, what you will be accounting is the actual carbon that is fixed in a permanent manner so that it's sequestered on a long-term period. So all the carbon that we actually lose in the stack is not accounted for in this end carbon calculation. So even if you have, say, a yield of 50%, you have 50% of carbon minus what you're losing in the stack. So technically, we're actually penalizing even more.
But if we have 50% of the carbon is present, the carbon that was in those chips is present in the biochar, that means the other 50% went up the stack. So if we assume there was no emissions in our counterfactual for that residue, then we haven't sequestered any carbon because we have 50% sequestered and 50% emitted. They'd cancel each other out and you would have zero carbon. You'd have a net zero carbon emission or sequestration. So then we don't have any carbon credits to sell because we haven't sequestered any carbon.
So the carbon coming in, right? Your feedstock coming in, it's not adding to your accounting, but it's basically as if it was already in the air, right?
Well,
if the feedstock you bring in, if it's at zero, it's as if it was already in the air, right? It was already destined to be in the air within 100 years.
Then that's not a zero emissions counterfactual. That's 100% emissions counterfactual.
It kind of is because it's it's biogenic CO2. So basically, it's considered carbon neutral. So, but if you issue credits for the avoided combustion, then you actually take it. You pretend that it has not been combusted, but it actually is, right? But this is not the problem because it's biogenic CO2 and can be emitted. So basically, what comes out of your stack, as you point out, is biogenic CO2, which by carbon requirements you can emit.
Okay, so I guess this is where we're sort of talking past each other, and I apologize for sort of misunderstanding that assumption. So I get it, and this is sort of where the life cycle accounting for biomass has gone over the years, but I think we can agree that carbon emitted today versus carbon emitted 50 or 100 years from now is fundamentally different. And we're making an assumption for sequestering carbon in the biochar. So another approach would be to account for carbon in both pathways and to net them out. You know what I mean? Like account for including the biogenic carbon in the counterfactual as well as in the biochar pathway, and then to net the two out. And this is sort of where things are headed in this carbon accounting space. Because otherwise, I mean, we're going to go down a rabbit hole of whether or not you should account for biogenic carbon in this kind of accounting. If we are taking as a given that no biogenic carbon matters unless it's methane or unless it's some other, then maybe I can get on board with the zero emission or zero net emission assumption. But I think that is a pretty big leap.
Yeah, I would agree. I think you inherently have to bring in the biogenic carbon if you want to show a benefit here. So I don't see how you avoid not bringing it in, because that's your counterfactual, is that this wouldn't have stuck around. These feedstocks would have decomposed. And I think there are scenarios, again, like some forest residues could have stuck around in the forest for a number of years and decomposed slowly, as opposed to harvesting them and pyrolyzing them. So I don't think it's always conservative to not include that.
I mean, the carbon in the biochar is also biogenic.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is a great discussion. I think I do want to keep moving on. So I do also want to recognize, though, that this is an issue that we're going to have to work on. It might be something that I reach out to some of you about to try to get some further thoughts on some different approaches that we might take. So definitely making note of this conversation for further consideration. So thanks for the discussion there. Let's move on.
We did, John, have a couple of comments in the chat box, so I'll just note that I'm going to make sure those get copied into the notes that we review.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marissa. Okay, so moving on to kind of coming back to the permanence bit in terms of estimating the recalcitrance of the carbon that's in the biochar. You know, there's some different standards that are out there that could be considered. I think what we would look at is just the approach that's been used often recently, with the assumption that there's a 0.3% decay rate annually for biochar with an HCORG less than 0.4. And so we would assume for a 100-year permanence period that there's 74% of the biochar remaining, or of the carbon remaining. And this is relevant to soil applications where this would be used. But the questions that I have are around non-soil applications, as well as around biochars of other composition, essentially, and recalcitrance. So figuring out what we might use there, whether that is based on lab analyses of the biochar, or if we might rely on you know, default factors based on production conditions instead. I think we've seen both approaches out there. So maybe starting with the non-soil applications, I guess I'm wondering if there is a good understanding of decay under other uses aside from soil applications. It seems like there isn't that much literature out there necessarily at this point. But I'd be interested in hearing if anyone does know of research that's being done in that area where that might inform the assumed permanence that we might have for non-soil applications.
I'll just comment that there is a lot of work on inventory methods applied to harvested wood products that stay wood and go into different end use applications, including construction. And so to the extent that a lot of the carbon that's stored in wood products is assumed to end up in the United States anyway, in modern landfills, and have a pretty high level of sequestration associated with it due to low oxidation. So I think you might be able to, for building materials, I'm not as concerned about building materials. I think a lot of work is out there that we could draw on. I'm more concerned about other types of products that the fate is unknown in the waste stream. So short-lived consumer products, other types of products, and it's a broader concern that to what extent is this a biochar standard versus there are a lot of industrial uses for charcoal. Do we have to cover all of them? So I think a lot of this is going to be driven by what end uses we allow to fall under this standard.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Yeah, I think that does make a lot of sense in terms of figuring out what will be eligible under this protocol and trying to limit things in that way. Yeah, that's definitely something that we're going to be puzzling over, is trying to figure out the standards around that. And I appreciate the comments around the fates of wood products as well. That is something that we look at with our forest protocol. So I think you know, we are somewhat familiar with that that work and that type of concept.
I mean, the easiest thing would be to define biochar as going in the soil, but I haven't got that vibe on this call previously that that's where we're headed. So, but that would be an easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
It is easier to do, but it's very limiting. You're going to reduce the amount of supply that you will get. And a lot of producers sell in a varied range of markets. I have a single producer sell in, you know, I don't know, fireworks, pets market, agriculture, cosmetics. This one producer sells tonnage in all of these markets and more. And so it could be done to limit the soils, but I think it would be a disadvantage. We would be giving out a disadvantage to producers who don't necessarily want to go into soil applications. And there's a lot of them, more and more.
Yeah, my question just would be, is that biochar if it's going into fireworks? It seems like that's not biochar. It seems like it's industrial charcoal.
You'd be right. In this case, it would be combusted. That was just an example. These shouldn't be actually yielding any CO2, you know, benefits. But in the term of industrial charcoal, charcoal is actually a type of biochar, and so a lot of charcoal manufacturers do sell biochar under either a different name or under the same name and in different markets. Yeah.
Josiah here. I think that one thing important to recognize is that also one of the reasons why a lot of biochar producers have expanded into non-soil applications is for higher prices available, and that part of the carbon credit funding that can come through this can actually make biochar applications in soil more possible than previously. And so while, you know, as somebody who is, you know, focused on almost exclusively utilization of biochar in agriculture, I can tell you that price is a major factor, and that it has been the most critical limiting factor to the utilization of biochar on a large scale in agriculture is the price burden. And so by reducing that cost with carbon credits can dramatically open up that space. And looking at the climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation benefits of biochar utilization in soil, I think that promoting biochar utilization in soil is not a bad thing. And that I think if we were to have a protocol that was very robust in the biochar pathway to soil, that would be very important. And also, you know, have a pathway for these other purposes. But I would hate to see other purposes drag down the whole thing. And so I think it's really important to find a way that we can have those pathways coexist. And so far, one of the approaches that has sounded very appealing, you know, one would be having the ton year. So for biochar in soil, which has been incredibly studied and has been acknowledged by IPCC and others, you can have the you know, 74% over 100-year permanence period as suggested here. And then biochar in other applications could potentially be the ton year approach, and it's upon the producer to do the extra work to prove that pathway out. And then as more pathways are well developed and defined, that they can become incorporated if shown to be of sufficient value and size.
And also, John will note that Akio comments, I think it's a safe assumption that biochar will decompose more rapidly in soil, constant moisture, moderate temperature, contact with microbes than in other materials.
David here, I think there's a difference in my view between biochar and other types of very pyrolysis products that could be going into asphalt, but would have a source material that could be quite different, like organic wastes and biosolids from sewage treatment plants. What makes biochar in my view is its use in soil, in agriculture. Otherwise it's ecochar or some other term rather than biochar.
I would have to say that there is not so much general consensus on nomenclature around the world, and especially not in the market. A lot of people will say biochar is not biochar unless it is charged. Will you agree or disagree in the same way that you called ecochar and other types of char? Plus, ecochar, I believe, is actually a trademark. So in terms of nomenclature, I think it is really important for CAR to actually have a full section on it. Because even the EBC, the IBI, to some extent, there might be some differences in nomenclature. And so it's a big problem in the industry in general.
I would agree that that's a very important piece for us to have in the protocol at some point.
And so is the suggestion that some of these other products that are not quite biochar, they should be considered for the protocol based on their having at least maybe somewhat similar properties or their ability in terms of recalcitrance and being able to store carbon and having end uses that can be tracked and kind of knowing what their fate is?
John, what do you call a biochar that is not a biochar?
I'm not sure.
Well, it's a pyrolysis byproduct. But there's a whole range of them, and as I said a minute ago, it really relates to my mind a lot with feedstocks. When we start getting into biosolids from sewage treatment plants, you can have some major environmental improvements across the board by doing it, but you don't get the kind of material for soil sequestration that you get from pyrolysis of woody waste. It's a different ballgame.
Yeah, but pyrolysis is one thing. You could also have gasification. You can have some incomplete combustions in some instances. So that's another barrier here in terms of nomenclature and defining what a biochar is, in fact, a biochar.
Yeah, okay. So I'll make a note that having the nomenclature established is really important for this.
Yeah, and relating it to the type of feedstocks into the pyrolytic system so that the different feedstocks end up with different production products.
Okay, thanks, David. So I guess the other part that I wanted to talk about here was just the application of biochars that have an HC org that is greater than 0.4. Whether continuing to do sampling for those makes sense, or if we should turn to looking at the production conditions would make more sense, or if those are perhaps even two separate things. I guess I would rely on the people who are more expert in this to chime in. if it's reasonable to include the biochars that have HC org that's between 0.4 and 0.7.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Not really. I would encourage you all to take a look at that paper that I sent a DOI link to. And as I know, this is now included in the IPCC inclusion of biochar as a carbon sequestration technology. There are two ways to go about it. The blunt pencil method is there are 3 temperature brackets, and there are different feedstock categories. And based on that, you can choose from a table what the permanence coefficient of your char is. Otherwise, there's a regression equation where you can plug in your HC org and spit out your permanence quotient. And in that regard, there can be a benefit or a reward for these very recalcitrant chars with an HC org, close to 0. And there is a detriment for also the low stable chars.
And do you think the application of that regression equation is a reasonable approach? I guess, I'm thinking about how we kind of have these categories that are set up. If we're saying it's less than 4 or 0.4 for HC org, we kind of take a conservative stance at 74%.
Yes. That regression equation captures all of this. And I don't know, in a way, just the fact that it's published in IPCC lends it some credibility.
Mm-hmm.
Or referenced in IPCC lends it some credibility, where that's worth,
Sure.
This is a big deviation from Vera because that would require everyone to measure the HC org. So I think this is great. I like the regression approach. But
so
instead of assuming,
well, it does not require you to measure the HC org. The other alternative is to simply choose one of 3 temperature brackets, low, medium, or high. Choose your feedstock type, and then based on that, you get your permanence quotient. So you can either look at it or you can insert org into the equation.
I see. You use the table and then put it in the regression. Or you can measure the HC, or you could have an option, which is it's actually kind of hard to do that. There's only a few labs that are set up to do that.
I actually think that having a regression
I could go
is a great idea.
And again, I'll say just look at the paper. The regression coefficient is kind of floppy. It's just a 0.31, but you see a whole bunch of scatter right around the middle. It's like everybody made chars, in the middling of God knows what feedstock, and so, whatever. But this is they did their due diligence on working this out. I can guarantee that one. It's the best yet so far.
Mm-hmm.
In my humble.
I think it's better than.
And if I could, since my microphone is now working currently, I just wanted to circle back. Sorry, John. To this question of what is biochar and is it strictly for soil, or do we exclude certain feedstocks, et cetera? My personal opinion is that the point of all of this is to promote carbon sequestration through pyrolysis of waste stream biomass. Pyrolysis of sewage sludge can produce, a stable char material. Granted, it is not suitable for agricultural purposes, but it does provide carbon sequestration. And so the real, there are three things that in my review of the IBI material standards, there are 3 points. Number 1 is provide carbon sequestration. Number 2 is do no harm, as in let's not mix heavy metals, concentrated heavy metal stuff into the soil or other toxics. And then number 3 is it's a soil, it's biochar specific to soil. And I personally take issue with the biochar is specific to soil. And I place importance on carbon sequestration and do no harm, so that non-soil applications remain available. But that's just my opinion.
Okay. Great, thanks, Aki. Rachel, was there something that you wanted to add as well? Or Melissa, I think both of you were trying to speak previously, but if not. Okay. Okay, I'd like to move on. We do have just about 20 minutes left here, and I think there are a couple of other topics that I want to cover. So the next one is a fairly big one too, and just the idea of potentially including the non-sequestration related benefits associated with biochar. So we're talking about soil priming, we're talking about nitrous oxide impacts, whether that's in soil or related to livestock or compost applications, and same thing with methane. And it seems like generally there hasn't been enough it seems like there hasn't been enough certainty around the benefits or being able to quantify the benefits and the particular conditions where benefits are provided for these, but I'm also not as current on the literature as I'm sure many of you are, so getting a better understanding of whether or not we might be able to include some of these things in the protocol would be really helpful.
I think it's a fantastic idea. However, it is so, not even project, it is so biochar application and matrix specific that it is extremely difficult, I think, to quantify. It would be extremely expensive, first of all, to quantify. And that would have to be done at a end user site, most likely. And I don't think there's enough data on the variability of biochar as it relates to these, potential additional GC impacts. It is not to say that there are no impacts. It's, I believe, a question of quantification and, accurately or without reasonable doubt that it could be nonsense for particular applications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my thought to how we would potentially approach this, if we're able to at all, is just being able to come up with default factors that we're able to apply, providing that certain conditions are met, based on what can be reasonably assumed to produce a benefit based on those conditions. And if the science isn't there yet, then the science isn't there yet. But this is something that I definitely specifically wanted to bring to the work group for consideration. So it sounds like maybe it's not there yet. But if any others have any thoughts around it, I appreciate it.
Just pulling up the paper from Akio that he sent. So that looks like Dominic and Johannes are recommending not to include priming, but that soil-based nitrous oxide reductions can be included. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, I kind of look at these as, these are the co-benefits of applying biochar to soils. So it definitely, the science is there that there's no extra harm being done to this end. Priming tends to wash out overall. So this is really a question of whether we want to give extra credit for soil applications that have these other co-benefits. I don't know the answer, but I mean, you could be conservative and just assume that any extra reductions are just a cherry on top. That would be a defensible decision, but I wouldn't be concerned about like emissions that you're not capturing. You know, this is really co-benefits typically.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I definitely agree, Rachel, and that's what I'm trying to look for, is if there are conditions under which we might provide that sort of kind of extra crediting, so to speak.
I mean, the nitrous oxide impacts are just so pervasive. So they recommend 23%. I have to look at this a little more closely in the equation, but 23% nitrous oxide reduction, I think, in this paper. So it's worth considering. I mean, the nitrous oxide reduction is pretty strong evidence for that. So I would consider that maybe before the priming.
Mm-hmm.
My question is more not whether it has an effect or not, is how can you quantify it and actually deliver it to a client who's looking for numbers. That's extremely application specific, extremely variable. And it's just in the nature of what we say a biochar is. It's extremely variable. So it comes back to all of the other effects and the variability. I think that a solution to this could be that under certain conditions, a project could earn, you know, an extra certification that says that this project does indeed limit an amount of NO2 being emitted without actually giving a number. And it could be viewed in the market as an additional, you know, certification, kind of like in the Vera space where there is additional, I don't know how to call them even, certifications.
It's pretty ironic because all the scientific literature is focused on this question. There's 5,000 papers on, you know, looking at emissions in mesocosms and in the field, but there's this disconnect, and I agree that it would be really difficult to try to actually measure this on a project by project basis. But this is just speaks to the point that, like, when we think about permanence and concrete versus soil, like, this kind of ties in the big picture, because this is where the soil applications really shine, I think, so, with that branding appeal as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. So it sounds like maybe this is not quite ready for prime time yet with some of these things, but can certainly be acknowledged as potential co-benefits from certain biochar applications. So we can maybe keep an eye on that going forward, but with this initial version of the protocol, I'll keep it simple and focus on the carbon, the embodied carbon.
Yeah, I would see if Johannes could weigh in on this before you, like, don't include it, but because
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I can definitely reach out to him too. That's a good idea. Okay. Moving on then, I think we just have a couple slides left, really. And we've got about 10 minutes left. So one thing we're looking at with all of our protocols around land use is just whether or not there's leakage. And so if you're not familiar with the concept, it's the idea that by implementing a project, you are changing the emissions or increasing emissions outside of your project boundary. And so we want to be able to capture that if there are significant leakage risks. And it seems like, generally speaking, with biochar, there's, when we're talking about sustainably sourced or waste biomass, that there's little to no risk of leakage. If there are any thoughts contrary to that, though, I would be happy to hear that. There's also the idea, you know, if we are looking at potentially including co-production of biochar with bioenergy, is there a potential leakage risk associated with that when we are changing where the biomass is going, instead of being used for bioenergy production, if it's being used for biochar instead? In my mind, it seems like that's maybe an area where there's potential leakage risk, but beyond that, I'm not sure. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm interested in the impact of this on transport of forest wastes, the degree to which we're having truck transport emissions in the years before we have a fully electrified truck fleet. It seems to me we had a lot of leakage as we move wood chips or wood material large amounts of distance to biochar production facilities, pyrolytic facilities, as opposed to smaller scale facilities located in or immediately adjacent to the forest. This becomes a big part for me of the LCA piece.
Yeah, and I think, so depending on the baseline scenarios that we're looking at, transportation would likely be, transportation emissions likely would be accounted for. There might be thresholds that we look at in terms of when you might have to account for it relative to distances being transported, but I think the intent would be to try to capture those emissions because they could potentially be significant.
I'm not sure if we could associate directly into leakage, maybe at a certain point, but just as an example of here in Canada, because I think most people are in the States, specifically in the Quebec region, our forestry industry generally does not take in tops, branches of trees unless they're obligated to. Most places they actually don't, and they leave in the woods. Now, something else that they do is actually they go around complete patches of trees because those are not interesting for the forestry industry, which is mainly based out of, for fir, spruce, and pine. And so a lot of hardwood is fairly much avoided. Having those projects into place pop up is allowing a more efficient collection in the woods. In a sense, that is a negative, because you're collecting more wood. But in another way, it does increase the efficiency of collection from the forestry industry. So it's just a comment, maybe not directly again in leakage, but this is something that we are seeing all over Quebec and in most of Canada, where foresters avoid certain types of trees.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. Okay, if there aren't any additional comments on leakage, we can move on to the last topic. So we had a lot of discussion around verification during the last meeting, and that's obviously going to be a critical piece of this. One thing I do want to bring up here, though, is just in terms of the monitoring, reporting, and verification that's required for projects, are there other standards that we're able to use as leverage to improve project efficiency in this regard? In particular, kind of looking towards IBI certifications or EBC. Are those reasonable standards that we might look toward you know, I note here that the devil's in the details because we want to make sure that we have our own standards that are set, and that if we were to rely on IBI or EBC certification, that those standards would be in line with what we require under the protocol. But I think generally speaking, it'd be helpful to hear whether or not those certifications seem like they might be something reasonable that we might really examine in more detail for this kind of thing.
I think the IBI makes a lot of sense for the purpose of this protocol. Let's not forget that this is destined to Canada and the US, so the EBC has, you know, less relevance, I believe.
Okay. And then one other thing, you know, we talked about the chain of custody tracking and the importance of that and being able to track the end uses. One thing that we might consider with this protocol is potentially pointing to an off-the-shelf option like carbon futures tracking service. Again, the hope would be to streamline the process of getting a project registered. So if that is able to fulfill all of the requirements that we have in terms of reporting and verification, then I think that's something that we would strongly consider. But again, any feedback on that in particular would be helpful if there are any objections to that kind of approach, or if there's strong support for that type of approach would be helpful.
I would agree that using a blockchain technology like Carbon Future would definitely be an advantage, because then you guys wouldn't have to spend a lot of time actually developing a method for tracking. That being said, I think we definitely have to examine Carbon Future's, you know, tracking services better and determine whether it is really efficient when it comes to the whole process, especially on the biochar buyer perspective. A lot of biochar buyers won't necessarily want to participate in this. Some yes, some no. I think there's an evaluation to be done on the efficiency of this method. But I would definitely be in favor of using something that has already been developed to save time and accelerate the process, streamline it as well.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Okay, doesn't sound like anyone has any other comments at this time. And we are.
Sorry, I guess on the chain of custody, I guess no matter what, it will still require some sort of third-party verification. Remember what service is used, is that correct?
Yeah, there would be some level of third-party verification that's required regardless. But if there's a way that Carbon Future offers some sort of streamlined approach to that, where it requires somehow less review by the verifier,
correct,
then that's, I think, what we would want to consider.
That sounds great.
Great, thanks for saying that. All right, so we are just about out of time. I'm sorry, was there someone else who? No, okay. So we will wrap up for today then. Again, if you have any comments on anything that we've talked about either today or previously or anything else really, feel free to send any feedback to me or to our general policy email. I'll pull those up in a second. But you can reach out anytime. I should have updated the date here, but we'll give you, a couple weeks here to provide any feedback. Let's say until December 1st. Reach out anytime in the meantime, before or after that, though, if you have anything that you want to discuss on any topic that we've covered. Otherwise, at the reserve, we will get started on our drafting. And we will work towards producing a draft that we're able to share with the work group. At the moment, we are tentatively planning to have a work group meeting sometime in January. We will figure out the exact date for that, probably sometime mid-December, and try to get everything set up for that as soon as possible so that we can have your time reserved on your calendars. And hopefully, we'll be able to have a draft protocol for you to review at that point. But as you can tell from some of the discussions that we have, some of these issues are a bit thornier. So whether or not we're able to actually have everything worked out by the time we want to have the next work group meeting remains to be seen. But we will keep you posted as we make progress. So with that, I think we can wrap things up. Thanks again for all of you for participating in the discussion today. All of your feedback is really helpful to this whole process. And it's really important to making sure we get a protocol that has integrity and that will have good buy-in from the public. So we appreciate all of your time and effort with this. And with that, we can say goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John. Have a good day.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.